Anybody there? If everyone could start making their way back to their seats, please.
All righty, let's go, guys. Sorry, and girls.
Okay, folks, we'll get our guest speaker tonight. He'd be familiar to most of you. Steve and Linda Sasson, their daughter, have been here before and have done some talks for us. Steve's a very experienced birdman, not just through being a private aviculturist, but also through his work as a professional ecologist. So has a lot of knowledge about a lot of bird species and other animals in general. Tonight, they'll be talking about their failures and successes with the Luzon bleeding heart pigeon. Undoubtedly one of the most beautiful species we have available to us in Australia. I'm sure some of you have bred them in the past, and hopefully a few of you still keep them. I've kept them in the past. A lot of failures, a little bit of success. So that's why I'm very much looking forward to Steve's talk tonight to see where I went wrong and hopefully keep him again in future. But if you'd like to please make Steve welcome, and let's get ready for a great talk.
I'll just stand up there. All right, thank you. Thanks for having us. It's been a while. I think it was, I don't know when we were here last, but wasn't that long, was it? Yeah, it's been pre-COVID, wasn't it? Yeah, okay, cool. Well, we've been asked a lot about bleeding hearts over the last probably 18 months. And that's probably because in the last 18 months, we've probably perched over 40. And I guess that hasn't been easy. It's definitely, there's been a lot of times where we've failed. I guess we wanted to just share the things that we've been doing that have worked. We want to share the things that we've done that haven't worked, because ultimately at the end of the day, if we are to succeed in our hobby, we really need to learn from our failures as well. 30 years ago, bleeding hearts, the Luzon bleeding heart was reasonably common in Australian aviaries, and there's not that many around these days. As we've seen with a number of other species, I know plumheads were talked about earlier. The list goes on of the species that generally do this big cycle. We have lots and then we have none. And then we try really hard and we have lots, and then we give up and have none. And this is one of those species that's really in the balance. So tonight, we're going to share on our 40 years of keeping this species. As I said, we've had heaps of failures, and if you take note of this bleeding heart dove sitting on a perch, and take note of how open its surroundings are, keep that in mind as we progress through this talk. We're going to talk a little bit about them in the wild. We're going to talk a little bit about housing them, what we've found works and what doesn't, sexing, compatibility, diet, breeding, transport, and finally, the most important things, the things you have to remember. But this lady here was, if you haven't heard the name, I'll tell you a little bit about Val Buller. Her husband was a winemaker, made the most amazing tawny port. If you've ever heard of Buller's Winery in Rutherglen, this is their family. And Val was a big champion for Bleeding Hearts. I first met her when I was about 18, and to me then she seemed like a fiery old lady. And she was a very passionate woman about her Bleeding Hearts. And at the time, from what I recall, I remember seeing about 20 or 30 Bleeding Hearts in her aviaries, and that's me and Linda standing in front of her aviaries. We went down to Rutherglen. Oh, that was probably, I'm going to say maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Most of the aviaries are all derelict now. There's only a few with some pheasants and things in it when we were there. But back when I first met her, when I was about 18, I remember her telling me she believed she had at least half of the Bleeding Heart doves in the country in her aviaries, and that was 20 to 30 birds. So she had some very lively discussions with zoos, and there was an attempt to develop a breeding program, which was sort of run by Adelaide Zoo at the time, and she was instrumental in making that happen. So she did only pass away last year, but I just wanted to mention, there's a lot of people in our circle that have a whole heap of knowledge, and I not only was I inspired by Val, but I certainly learned a lot from her. And here's another photo I want you to have a think about. The one at the top there, you'll notice the shade cloth on the aviary. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. I love Bleeding Hearts. I've talked about my obsession with birds, and that's sort of it in a snapshot. Sort of added this one up the other day, and I was a little surprised at what we kept and what we bred. I always throw the red-eared firetail in there because the red-eared and beautiful firetails I will tackle them one day. I just don't know where or when. And of course, a lot of you actually saw our obsession firsthand. That was on the Perch Bird Park from the sky. 18 aviaries in total, 100 plus species of birds, 75,000 visitors in 5 years. It was pretty cool. The obsession's got a little bit smaller now. That's my backyard. It's the first time I've publicly shown it. I guess we're always a bit wary of what people understand of what we might have in our backyard. So you won't see too much detail in that photo, and that's only about a quarter of my backyard. But that's where most of the aviaries are. It's a much smaller affair. All right, well, introducing the Bleeding Heart. So I was sort of best described as a moderately sized pigeon, smaller than a homing pigeon, more round. They're listed as CITES 1, so essentially means that their trade is restricted around the world. All of the Bleeding Heart species are now either endangered or critically endangered in the wild. And for most of them, the key threats have been habitat loss and the bushmeat trade. Still a very, very popular bird to eat in the Philippines. So the Luzon Bleeding Heart is endemic to the island of Luzon. Punalada is the local name, meaning stabbed pigeon. And of course, that's where the Bleeding Heart dove gets its name, from that classic stab wound in the front. I did find some really interesting stories about the I guess local legends in bleeding heart doves, and there was some pretty incredible stories, pretty similar to our Aboriginal people and Dreamtime. So they certainly have been a long and interesting part of Philippine culture. So in the wild, this species is from sea level up to 1,400 metres or so, and there are 3 recognised subspecies and 1 presumed extinct. But there are other bleeding hearts. This is not the only one. There are 7 species in total. One's assumed extinct. All of them are in the Philippines except one. There's an Indonesian endemic. I forget its name, but when you look at it, it's not red. It's actually this washed out lemon colour. It doesn't even rank as a bleeding heart to me, but nonetheless, it is there. And at the moment, this is the only species we have in Australian zoos and Australian aviaries. So I found this little map on the internet. All those different coloured parts of the Philippines support different species of bleeding hearts. So you can see that this is a species that's evolved over time and taken, I guess, evolved separately on using that theory of island biogeography and slightly varied itself over time. So that's the 6 species that are found in the Philippines. Then there's this one. I was told for years and years that there was only ever 1 species of bleeding heart in Australia. But we now know that that's actually wrong. This species was also in Australia. And we know that because we've got records from Adelaide Zoo. The pair was purchased from the Keston Bird Farm in England. Now, the YouTuber that I like to think I am got straight onto YouTube and I Googled the Keston Bird Farm. And there's these amazing black and white videos of this place. It is insane. You've got to have a look at it. I can't find when it closed. They're a massive importer of birds and then a distributor of birds around the world. There are aviaries with literally thousands of Gildian finches in them, and plenty of other finches as well. But so this pair of bleeding hearts came from England, and they arrived at Adelaide Zoo in 1932 for a massive £2. We even know they bred them, but we don't ever know what happened to them. The record cards don't show us that. So that's an excerpt from the Adelaide Zoo records, which shows how high-tech things were in those days with the typewriter. Does make a note there, I think, length of life in zoo, 13 years. If only we had that species still. I get asked this one a lot. Why the bloody hell would you want to keep bleeding hearts for? They're always flighty. They stir up my finches. They're big and clumsy. They'll even attack my finches when they're on the ground. I'm going to need a big aviary. And all those other excuses I've listed. The dirty pigeon's a good one. Why would I want to keep a pigeon? I got asked recently, what's the difference between a pigeon and a dove? Nothing. That's exactly right. People like to classify things. We like to say that big doves are pigeons and small pigeons are doves. There is nothing physically different between the two. So here's my counter argument. They're not flighty when housed properly. They do pretty well in a mixed collection. You don't need a big aviary. In fact, we're finding that they perform really well in smaller aviaries. And I always love to throw in the fact it's a dove, not a pigeon, even though that really doesn't matter. And they're pretty rare in Australian aviaries now. There's a few people keeping them, but there's not too many people breeding them. And if aviculture has to be the hero in the day, we will lose this species if we don't do something about it. Now, if you cast your eye back to that first video or that first picture I showed you that showed the bleeding heart dove with the mesh in the background and the full sky, that's not how to keep bleeding hearts in our experience. You can keep them that way, sure. We're finding now that at least 2/3 of the roof has to be covered in, whether that's with corrugated iron and alcinite or shade cloth or some sort of what we call the canopy. You've got to think about how this bird lives in the wild. It lives in closed forest. It doesn't live out in the open paddock. It might skirt around the forest edges, but it doesn't live out in the open. You can see by our aviary sizes there that I've mentioned, they're not big aviaries. I remember my first pair of bleeding hearts I tried to keep in an aviary that was 6 metres by 9 metres. And I wondered why they'd always fly up and smash their head on the roof. They don't need big space. We're breeding them very successfully, 3 nests a year in an aviary that's only 2.4 by 2.4. These birds spend a lot of time on the ground. The only time they're really off the ground is when they nest. So well planted, remember that forest. Lots of dense areas, but also lots of open areas. Like that. Nice sandy open floor. Remember, they're going to spend time on the ground, so they've got to have walking space. But they've got to feel like they're closed in. And we all love how cool bleeding hearts are, and we go, I'll get 3 pair and I'll put them in the one aviary. We never do that. It's probably been done. I'm sure it's probably been done, but it's not the way that you'll have the most success with them. Only 1 pair per aviary. Just a view of another aviary, just showing there's an open floor area. This happens to be a walkway to the adjoining aviary, so it has a dual purpose, but lots of planting. Now, this particular aviary I built 2.5 years ago, so there's no excuse for plants. But I can hear us say one question: aren't pigeons dumb? Yes. Yes, they are. This bleeding heart dove got itself caught in the vegetation. Didn't get caught under the ring, just got its leg caught in the fork of a plant. Luckily, we picked this bird up during we check our aviaries 3 times a day, and it was picked up in one of those checks. I guess one of the plants I would definitely avoid when you're planting is tiger grass. Tiger grass is fantastic in aviaries, but oh my God, you will kill so many of your birds because they get caught in it. It's like a bamboo, but grows better and doesn't spread. Another example of one of our breeding aviaries. So again, about 2/3 of the roof fully covered, well planted, open space on the floor. And this one's only about 1.9 metres tall. You hit your head on it. Only 1.8 metres tall then. maybe too much sand and gravel in there. Now, this is one of the 2.4 by 2.4 metre breeding aviaries, so quite small and fully roofed. We chose to fully roof these because of the small size. The fully roofed feature has basically two benefits. It closes the birds in, which gives them, they lose that level of nervousness. If you've ever kept bleeding hearts, you'll see how nervous they can get when they can see the sky and beyond. They don't like it. So it takes that away. But the other good thing with a closed roof, of course, is if you've got goshawks and they're running all over your aviary roof, these guys will be totally oblivious to it. Just another view of another one of our breeding aviaries. You'll also note, I haven't got a pointer, but you'll see on that top beam, there's a little black piece sticking out. All of our aviaries have lights in them. These are just a cheap light from Bunnings. They come on automatically. They're a solar light, so we've stuck it under the polycarb sheet, so they charge during the day. As soon as it turns dark, they turn on, and they're only about a 5-watt globe. So it's like a night light for kids. If they manage to get themselves a little unsettled during the night, they can find themselves and not stress. We have those in all of our aviaries. If you insist on having a big aviary, hail mesh is pretty good. But I would totally say if bleeding hearts are one of your targets, or in fact any of the native pigeons, or any pigeons at all, the hail mesh is great, because what a pigeon does in an aviary, it will look past the wire and it will spot a tree over the other side of the yard or in the neighbour's yard, and it will want to fly to it without seeing what's in the middle. And I think that's where people get the thought pigeons are dumb, because they'll just fly and hit the wire. They're not looking at the wire, they're looking at where they want to go. Hail mesh is good for that because it's very forgiving for a pigeon. It'll hit the mesh, fall on the ground, and it won't be dead. Whereas if it's a wire wall, it's very different. But bleeding hearts, given that they hardly fly, and even in the wild they hardly fly. In the wild they'll nest only within 1.5 to 2 meters off the ground. So they're literally flying from the ground up 2 meters. A couple of wing beats. They don't need a big aviary. All right, sexing. I've had plenty of discussions with people about sexing bleeding hearts, and I'm sure there's ways that people do it. Some of the pigeons you can sex with eye and leg colour. Yeah, I get that. I used to always be told that the male had the brighter stab wound than the female, the bigger and brighter stab wound. That's definitely not right. Look, we just go with DNA. And I'm just going to show you very quickly to that front photo, because that is the one that gets most people. Everyone makes an assumption, well, not everyone, a lot of people make an assumption when they see this photo, cock's on the right, hens on the left. And for this pair, it's not. The cock is on the right, the hen's on the left. So the stab wound has absolutely nothing to do with it. Sorry, cock is on the left. Cock is on the left, hen is on the right. Yeah, you did. My apologies. Now, just got to remember where we were. We're at sexing, weren't we? Current slide. Great. Stick with DNA. David Groth over there in Western Australia has never got it wrong for us. It's always been spot on. All right, compatibility. We've always talked about compatibility with birds, and a pair is not always a pair. Well, it is a pair. They may not like each other. I always say to people, just because you have a pair of birds doesn't mean they're going to breed. And this is very true with bleeding hearts. They are very, very finicky in their having a compatible mate. Once they do form that pair bond, it's pretty strong. So the best thing to do, in my opinion, is to essentially, if you have a pair that's bred for you, I wouldn't separate them unless you really had to. On the flip side, you can get a pair of bleeding hearts and they'll do absolutely nothing. And 12 months later, they've still done nothing. I wouldn't hesitate in splitting them apart and trying a new partner. Because often that maneuver can really get them going. I've always found too that if you can, having them in an aviary next door is beneficial. You know, I've said before when I've talked about fairy wrens and stuff, the last thing you want is a pair of fairy wrens in the adjacent aviary, because all they do is fight with each other. This seems to have the opposite effect, and they start to breed quite well. And there's never any fighting between the wire. So I can only assume that it stimulates the other pair into breeding. Definitely don't put two pair in an aviary, because someone will die. They will kill. And in saying that, we keep our birds in the aviary, our young birds, for about 6 weeks, and we always take them out because there can be issues with, especially with the cockbird. If you've got a faint stomach, turn away now, because I'm going to show a couple of slides that show blood. This one's not too bad. So cock on the left and hen on the right. That's essentially an overnight Barney from a compatible pair that have bred before. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes we've had pairs bred. One particular pair I'm thinking of that happened last year, they produced 3 nests, and then he killed the hen after 2 chicks had just fledged. The 2 chicks were too young to remove, and we kept a very close eye. He continued to feed the chicks, but then he knocked them off in the night as well. And he was a brilliant cockbird. I can't explain what happened. The next slide's the bad one. That's a cock to a hen in one night. Yep. So compatibility means everything. If you think there's an argument going on, separate them before it gets to that. All right. Whenever I look at this slide, I've got to say, I've got to talk about my youngest daughter, Holly. A lot of you have met Holly. She was our senior bird keeper at the park, and she continues to manage our bird collection now. And I think she's a bit OCD with her feed dishes, but it looks, I like it. It looks impressive. But diet, bleeding hearts eat just about anything. And I think variety is definitely the key. So that sort of gives you a breakdown of the types of food that we offer. Madeira cake and the soft bill mix is fed all year round. Live food is all year round as well. For a pigeon, bleeding heart doves need live food. There's no question. I don't know too many people that have bred bleeding hearts without live food. They may have one nest a year. At the moment, some of our pairs, we've got one pair that usually does 4 nests a year. So live food's critical, and an increase in live food when the eggs are just about to hatch. Plenty of fruit and veg, and of course the normal supplements as well. If anyone wants that, that's our soft bill mix recipe. If anyone wants that mix, I can send through our recipe to the club. Basically, it's a base on kangaroo mince. So it's protein followed by boiled eggs, more protein, chicken crumbles, more protein, insectivore mix, more protein, protein boost, just because we haven't got enough protein, grated cheese, more protein, and we blitz it all together, and it looks like that. That was pretty much our mix when we were operating the bird park, and pretty much every bird would eat that. Parrot, finch, quail, pigeon, cassowary. I said, yeah, bleeding hearts do spend a lot of time, most of their time on the ground. I've never been one to put my food on the ground. I think it's just something goes back a long time, and thinking about rodents in your aviaries, and we can never be too complacent when it comes to rodents. So I've always kept my feed dishes off the ground, and that's how we do it. That's just a piece of welded galvanized RHS, and the pigeons fly up to that and feed no problems. So I just feel more comfortable with it off the ground. I'll just talk a little bit about, I didn't cover it before, apologies, just compatibility with other birds. We keep our bleeding hearts in a couple of different situations. Firstly, they may be the only bird or pair of birds in an aviary, or they're in a mixed collection with finches, other doves, and softbills and lorikeets in some instances. The only time I've ever seen a problem with a bleeding heart dove trying to take on another bird is when the other bird tries to sit in a bleeding heart dove nest. That's about it. I've definitely heard of people talking about them attacking young, undercooked finches that come onto the ground, and a bleeding heart will attack them. I've never seen that happen. We have 40 plus bleeding hearts at the moment, and if we were going to see it, we'd see it. Never seen it happen. You could understand that they may have an argument with a species like button quail, particularly if it's live food. If there's a trigger around live food on the ground, I don't know, but we generally don't see it. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen. Right, breeding them. They don't really have a particular breeding season. We're down on the far south coast, so we're 6 hours drive south of Sydney. Our weather is fairly cool. We get the lovely cool winds off Bass Strait and the Southern Ocean tearing at us. And this is a bird from the tropics. We don't have any issues with keeping them in a cold climate. And we certainly don't have a defined breeding season. I don't like to have our birds breeding all year round, obviously, because it takes a lot out of your birds. So the way that we manage that is that we try to limit live food when we don't want them to breed. And in those mixed collection aviaries, that's obviously easier to line up with whatever else you're trying to keep. So if you're breeding finches that you want to breed in spring and summer, you're going to be increasing live food anyway. That's when your bleeding hearts are most likely to breed. They do like to nest in a fairly dense area. As with every species of pigeon or dove, they are amazing nest builders, and they use about 3 twigs to hold up their eggs, which never works. But the big thing to remember is that they generally nest in the same spot all the time. You know, you'll have a pair of finches will build a nest, raise some chicks, and then they may use the same nest, they may rebuild another one. Bleeding hearts always like the same spot. So you've got to keep that in mind if you're changing brush, and you've certainly got to keep that in mind if you're using nesting containers. And I've already talked about live food. Live food is definitely very important. It took us a little while to really get the hang of bleeding hearts when it came to supplying them with something to breed in. And half the time, they really just decided to do it themselves anyway. So that bird on the left is, I'm pretty certain that's a maggot tray that it decided to build its nest on, and some sort of feed dish, the one on the right. But basically, once they get an idea in their head, they like to stick with it. But both these types of nesting locations can be problematic because the birds are exposed, quite open, and eggs can roll out. So particularly the nest on the left. So we started to trial these hanging baskets, good old Bunnings, the bird keeper's paradise. 30 centimetre hanging baskets with coconut liner. And the good thing about these is when the bird sits in the nest on the eggs, they're sitting down nice and low, and they almost don't even know you've come in and out of the aviary. So they're not scared off the eggs. They're not accidentally rolling the eggs out of the nest. You know, you've got to go in the aviary and service your birds. The last thing you want to do is scare the bleeding heart sitting on eggs. So these seem to give them that extra level of confidence that everything's okay. We put a little bit of straw in the bottom just to get things started. So just the teff straw. The other thing we find really useful is Casuarina needles. She oak is the common name of the tree. We're pretty lucky. We've got a lot of that growing on our block, so it forms dense mats, which is dried out, and it makes the perfect nesting material. And the big thing there, the stick nest is actually not really critical. We've had birds just use the little bit of teff straw that we put in the bottom of it. They don't actually even build a nest, they just use that. So when they do decide to start building, sometimes the cockbirds can be really ambitious. And I've seen cockbirds carrying sticks all day for 2 or 3 days. They're just, I don't know what it is. Sometimes the sticks end up in the nest, sometimes they don't. But we generally give them a variety of fine twigs just so they can go through the motion. All right, so they're not a fruit pigeon, so they do lay 2 eggs instead of 1. Incubation is pretty much just short of 3 weeks. And the hen will sit at night and they'll share it during the day. They can be not amenable to you checking on the chicks. I don't know what it is at the moment, but there seems to be a generation of bird keepers that think that they can stick their hand into every bird nest they have in their aviary and everything will be okay. And look, some species, that's okay. You know, you can get away with it. Sometimes bleeding hearts are good, sometimes they're terrible. And I have seen them. We have had them desert nests. We still have one particular pair that if you walk into the aviary and make contact with that bird, it's all over. It's that serious. I can guarantee it that tomorrow they will not be sitting on those eggs or they will not be feeding those chicks. So whenever that pair nests, we're under strict instruction not even to look at them. Just walk in the aviary and just imagine they're not there. So just before they're due to hatch, pump up the live food. So non-breeding season, or no, incorrect, there is no non-breeding season. When we don't want them to breed, we usually want to, now what did I say before? I said 8 grams of mealworm per bird, which Linda described it better as a small pinch of mealworms. Then we double that in the breeding season per bird. So we've got there. Yeah, so don't muck around with the nest. If you don't know that pair, if this is a first time pair and they've never bred for you before, just don't. Just keep your hands out of there. Because it won't be long and they'll actually be coming out of the nest. There is a hand, and this is a hand for a reason. This is to show you what not to do. Don't use a colander. So you can see with a colander, colanders are fairly shallow. That used to be what we tried with bleeding hearts, was the good old past the colander. They're just not deep enough. You know, the birds sort of, the time there's a bit of straw or a bit of grass in there, they're sitting on top. So the eggs or chicks are just going to roll out onto the ground. This particular bird is pretty bulletproof. And I say there's no room for error because there's not. You know, we actually don't really know how many bleeding hearts are left in Australian aviaries. I've got a feeling the last regional plan for Australian zoos, there might have been only, I think it might have been in the 20s of all Zoo and Aquarium Association member zoos in Australia, there was only 20 odd bleeding hearts in the country. And that's not many. So then you think about private avies, we pretty much, there's a few people that have 1 or 2 pair. There's not too many that have more than that. So we don't want to make mistakes. So yeah, so once they are a few days old, you can definitely start to play around with them and get some rings on them. So they fledge around 12 to 16 days. Like most pigeons and doves, they're all wings pretty much when they leave the nest. And when they do jump out of the nest, they pretty much hang around on the ground, and that's when mum and dad will actually roost down with them as well on the ground. Otherwise, they're generally roosting off the ground. So that's the other time they leave the ground, is when they roost. But that is pretty much, that's a bird that's just jumped. So they're pretty much a brown pigeon. So if you keep other pigeons with your bleeding hearts, which you can do, we've successfully kept them with brush bronze wings and white-headed pigeons. We have had a few issues actually with rose-crowned fruit doves, where the rose crowns and the bleeding hearts will definitely take each other on, and the rose crowns will generally win, which is an interesting one. They are pretty smart. It's an interesting statement there. And I put that in because when you're trying to find them, you know that they've jumped the nest, you can't find them. No matter how, we've had 2 people in an aviary and spent half an hour and still haven't found them. So they're pretty secretive. And I think it's basically down to them just trying to avoid being eaten. Just a top view of that coconut basket. I can't emphasize these baskets enough. I think these have been one of the big turnarounds for us. Just giving that bird, giving the adult birds the extra confidence to hide while still incubating, not losing eggs or chicks out of the nest. Another couple of views there. So you can see in that nesting basket to the left, it's pretty much just teft straw, teft hay, which we often use as an alternative to November grass when we can't get November grass. None of that nest is built by the bird. We've put that all in ourselves and the birds used it. The one on the right is a good example of the she oak needles. So the Casuarina needles, they're about that long. They're only probably a millimetre thick. And that nest is built with that, but also you can see, I don't know if any of you have used this material. It's sort of a wide piece. That's a product called wood wool. It's like wood shavings, but it's in a long strand. If you order things online from online shopping, stuff often comes, that's often a packing material around what you've bought. So it's sort of a long strand, sometimes sort of that long, about 5 millimetres wide, and it's wood shavings in a big long strip. You can buy that online. Our diamond firetails love it, but the pigeons use scraps of it as well. Most of the time, our birds will rear both chicks, but not always. I don't know whether there's any, I can't pick whether there's any reason why. It just, we have birds have different clutch sizes. But when they do, and they do hatch on the same day, they're pretty interesting to watch, particularly when they feed both chicks at once, which is that slide, that picture on the left. And if you've ever had pigeons or doves watching them regurgitate, they're throwing that milk up. It's pretty horrendous to watch. You almost think they're going to pass out. Seems like an obvious one, transport, but the bleeding heart dove's also been known to be the bleeding capped pigeon, red-capped pigeon, because in transport they can often take their scalp off, and that's just from moving up and smashing their head on the roof of the carry box. So keep your carry box narrow, so there's not much, or short, so there's not much vertical movement. And use padded foam on your ceiling at a very minimum, but I also recommend it on some of your walls as well. And hydration. I know that's probably a silly thing to say, but I find that doves can go downhill really quickly when they have moisture taken away from them. Often when we transport birds, we think, we'll throw in a bit of cucumber and they'll be right with, and that's the case with finches generally. But bleeding hearts can definitely go downhill quickly. So I would suggest a water bowl with a sponge in it, and glue the water bowl to the bottom of the transport container and fill that sponge full of water or spark. The cardboard boxes, I've used cardboard before. Obviously, if I've just got birds on the back seat of the car, I would never use them to send with a freight company, but at least with cardboard with holes put into it, that they're not going to damage themselves too much. All right. Take-home messages. They're definitely a species that needs us. I think bleeding hearts, they're such a visually characteristic species. You know, we often see, particularly with, you know, threatened species conservation, it's always the cute and cuddlies that get the attention. You know, you'll always see a politician holding a koala, but you'll never see them, you know, with a Gouldian finch or something, you know, or a bleeding heart dove. I think certainly everything we've learned about breeding bleeding hearts so far, you know, puts backyard aviculturists right in the front seat, because we generally don't have big aviaries, and we can generally cater to these little niches quite easily. Nesting in the same location, I did cover that before. So for example, we had a pair that bred quite successfully over 12 months. Every time we decided to do a brush change, this pair actually had built their own nest in some brush, which we thought was fantastic. You know, the nest was solid. They always reproduced. We kept leaving this brush in this particular corner of the aviary because they were always nesting. And then we removed, they weren't nesting, so we took the opportunity to replace the brush, and that pair never bred again for another 2.5 years. So nothing else had changed. They have issues. And I think if we get to learn what those issues are, we can get around those issues. So all right. Always got to throw some acknowledgements out there. All pretty self-explanatory. Yeah, obviously without a few key people in my life, my agricultural journey would not be as it is. And so I expect lots of questions. Thank you.
Okay, any?
That's a great question, actually. All right, is Fat Tony still operating? Well, if you've been to Tarthru before, you'd know Fat Tony's Bar and Grill was the most amazing place to eat in Tarthra. COVID sort of killed it. Then Tony, who's not very fat, decided to sell. And as soon as he did decide to sell, his chef went, "See you later." And now he's trying to sell a restaurant with no chef. There's no one to work there because it's for sale. So he just sort of does bar snacks now. It's not the same. It used to be a great feed, but yeah, no. So it is still there, but don't go there because you won't get a feed. I didn't expect that question. Yes, tiger grass. No. It's got another name. I didn't know it as tiger grass. I've called it lots of other names, but I can't really repeat those. Look, it's a type of bamboo. It's a clumping bamboo, so it doesn't spread, but it's marketed by nurseries as tiger grass. Grows to about 3 meters tall, grows very quickly. Have you got another name, Linda? You're not going to pronounce it? Oh my goodness. Thysanthelina. Thysanthelina is its genus name. Yeah, but tiger grass. It's a beautiful, attractive plant, but what it does, it throws up the traditional bamboo stalks. A bird gets startled and flies for vegetation to hide in it, but basically it doesn't have horizontal perches, so the bird drops down, and essentially the tiger grass forms almost a jail cell in the middle, and the bird's trapped in the middle, and it can't get out, or it gets wedged in. Yeah. Look, we've lost finches in it. We've lost pigeons in it. I know people that have lost bowerbirds in it. You, Maddie? Yes. Sorry, I didn't cover that. We generally find by 12 months of age, they should start to reproduce. I didn't really talk about longevity either. So I know we've had hares that are in their teens that are still breeding. I know of at least one bird that is 23 years of age that has stopped breeding. It's not in our collection, it's in another collection. But I think it'd be fairly safe to say they breed right into their teens. Yeah. Look, no different to other birds. Obviously with pigeons, you can have things like canker. Managing your birds is something that we all should be very aware of, and yeah, I think nothing specifically jumps out that says, hey, they're a problem. They're not a dirty pigeon. Did you have another one, Maddie? So hang on. So we remove the. Oh yeah. So once we remove the fledglings once they're independent, and it doesn't matter where we move them to. So we close ring all our birds, so we pretty much keep a track of everybody. We have four separate bloodlines that we have, and we have a mix of those as well. So the most important thing for us is our record keeping, to make sure that we're not putting. Yeah. Oh yeah. Sorry, they don't kill each other as babies. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, good question. So we've got one particular aviary that is 6 meters by 2 meters. That's a sort of a make-do holding aviary at the moment that has about 12 offspring in it that we're just waiting on DNA back. We don't have any issues with anything at the moment. I think the main issues come about when there's an opportunity to breed. Those aviaries are brushless, basketless, they have perches. There's multiple feed stations. So we've never noted any aggressive behaviour in that situation. But we're also not putting adult birds in with them either. They're only this season's young. So look, we generally put ourselves, as you can see with that drone shot, we don't have a massive backyard aviary collection or aviary setup. We never have ourselves in a position where we have spare adult birds sitting around generally. We still do a lot of trade with Australian zoos, and we're still working at getting a lot of bleeding hearts out into the private agricultural community. So at the moment, we never find ourselves having to put surplus adults in with juveniles. If I needed to do it, I would probably just do single sex. I would. It's a really good question about the price. We've grappled with this one for a while. So they've been around the $250 mark for a long time, a pair. I felt it was totally inappropriate for the scarcity of the bird and how difficult the bird it actually is. And so I started to test the market a little bit. It's probably a terrible thing to do, but really, to me, the most important thing is not really about the money, it's about where they end up. Because we've seen in so many situations that people with the most amount of money will buy birds, and then all of a sudden we're in a mess because they don't have much in agricultural skill. They have money. I listed some birds for $950 a pair. They're gone in 5 minutes. So I still don't know where the limit is. I have since dropped the price, but I also have a 2.5-year waiting list at the moment. So I have a list of 30 odd people that have expressed interest in bleeding hearts. Oh, look in the shop. I'm sure they destroy themselves in a cabinet in, no? Oh, yeah. Oh, look. Linda will confirm at the bird park, we had them in our Asian walk-in aviary, which is the first aviary as you left the park, as you left the entrance area. And if we had 20 cents every time someone had come racing back in, you've got an injured bird in this aviary. And it's like, yes, we know what it is. No, you need to come and have a look. So we'd have to go out and tell them what it was. And it was just, yeah. You would get it all the time. Yeah. Yes. And it's, people don't read signs. People do not read signs. That's definitely the case. So yeah, so in relation to what I think their value is now, I'm really not. Their value is more important with an agriculturist that can actually breed them. So, but it's nice to get some money for them when you do breed them. Yeah.
Just a question regarding, I kept them many years ago when, like, I agree with you, terrific bird, the mixed collection. They were fine with the finches, no issues. I did breed some, but I also lost quite a few young in the nest, particularly in the first 5 days. Have you had the same problem? If so, would you have any idea what that might be caused by?
Thanks. Yeah. Were you feeding live food? Yeah. My first instance would be nest inspections, but I don't know whether you're tempted to look in the nest. Yeah, look, nothing specific. Live food is the first. It would definitely be the go-to. Other than that, then you got the usual suspects of, disturbance, raptors, owls, that sort of thing. Yeah, and sometimes they are poor parents. Yeah. Was it just the one pair that you had? Yeah, right. And yeah, were they a young pair or? Yeah, okay. It's and and it's almost to be said with like the site nest fidelity, sticking to the same nest site all the time. If something was to change in that aviary that was different, yeah, they can be as finicky as that. So, yeah, sorry, I can't give you anything more. Yeah. Any other questions for me? No? Excellent.
Again, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a fantastic talk. Just something from the club. Thank you very much. Thanks, mate. Thank you. And also something for you when you get home to warm up the insides as well. So, again, thanks, Steve. We hope to see you back again. Okay, folks, raffle time. So over to you, Joe. We'll do a lucky door prize first. Okay, we'll do that last.